He's an attorney and a policy advocate with a background in litigation, government enforcement actions, investigations, compliance, and congressional oversight, which probably means he's one of the most popular people in DC right now, at least with a certain segment. He's currently an attorney with the law firm of Harris, Wiltshire, and Granis in Washington, D.C. He was previously appointed by President Obama to serve as the Deputy Chief of Staff for U.S. Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE. And he was also a counselor to the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. John has also served with as senior counsel to then Chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, to Senator Patrick Leahy. So welcome, welcome. I'm going to turn it over to John.
Thank you, Gina. And thank you, Emma, for your efforts in coordinating all this. And I also want to obviously take time to thank the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy for the kind invitation to join you for this conversation today. I obviously would love nothing more than to be in Salt Lake tonight. For obvious reasons, we can't be together, which reminds me that many people have suffered over this last year. And so for those of you watching, I wish you and your family well and much health. Before I get started, I have to say that nothing I say tonight should be construed as legal advice in any way, shape, or form. And nothing that I say should be attributed to my law firm, Harris, Wiltshire, and Granis. These are entirely my comments based on my own experience as a private citizen, as a federal public servant, and as an attorney in private practice today. And the PowerPoint presentation should be up. There we go. So starting with the first slide, as I was thinking about the comments that I was going to make today, I was reminded of the longtime Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who coined the phrase, all politics is local. Next slide, please. And in order to understand the politics of immigration, everyone needs to understand that it begins with your own personal American experience. So in the next 30 plus minutes, I want you to be able to understand my own experience, because that is how I got to where I am. And it's fundamentally why the issue is so important to me. I am the proud son of Mexican immigrants. I'm a first-generation American whose roots begin in the fields of the Yuma Desert along the Colorado River, embedded in the culture and community of migrant workers. This is the lens with which the world viewed me and from which I viewed it. From a very, very young age, I observed that the politics of the day are always directly impact the policies of the day. I quickly began to understand that we are certainly a nation of immigrants, and we are certainly a nation of laws. But this is premised on the idea that you can accomplish great things in America if you dedicate yourself, work hard, and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. However, you have to have boots to begin with. Now, I was very fortunate. I did have boots, I did have shoes. And growing up, a kid in Southern California in the 80s was pretty idyllic. Next slide, please. I spent a lot of time as a child spending my summers in the Yuma sector, as it is now known, understanding the plight of migrant workers because my family come from a deeply rooted migrant working family. But the 80s in California were pretty amazing for another reason. Next slide, please. It was the era of the Lakers, it was the era of the Dodgers, and it was the era of Ronald Reagan. And I quickly learned that you never bet against the Lakers, the Dodgers, or Ronald Reagan. Next slide, please. Ronald Reagan's compassion, his empathy, and the kindness that he showed toward immigrants is something that was consistent with his views on the promise of America. And Latinos bought into that. Latinos, by and large, supported Ronald Reagan because he supported us. Next slide, please. Ronald Reagan in 1986 signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86. Some know it as IRCA. IRCA was a pretty substantial piece of legislation. It was tough on border enforcement. There were significant penalties for employers who hired unauthorized workers. And probably what most people remember is that it created a legal path for unauthorized migrants to stay in the United States had they been present 5 years or more. The net result was nearly 3 million people that were able to legalize in the United States. And like I previously said, what this did for the United States was amazing. And it was certainly amazing for the Latino community. Unfortunately, this great decade for Latinos was short-lived in the sense that quickly we started to see a building of animosity. We started to see a rise in xenophobia. Next slide, please. What is probably most prevalent is that in the early 90s, we started seeing the anti-immigrant sentiment grow. Politicians were using it, leveraging it for political gain. The most significant piece of legislation, if you will, was actually a proposition, California Proposition 187. Some of it called it, as it was known, the Save Our State Initiative, which, among other things, it ensured that undocumented immigrants could not use emergency health care. They could not have access to public education and other services in the state of California. Now, this screenshot that you see here was taken from a television advertisement. It was quite ominous. And the footage here is of undocumented immigrants crossing the freeway in California. If you actually heard the commercial, you would hear a voiceover that stated, "They keep coming." And that was the sentiment that a lot of us felt, that people felt us as the other. We were invading the country. It was a Hispanic invasion crossing the border, something that we've heard a lot of over the last 20, 30 years. Now, unfortunately, this proposition passed overwhelmingly with a nearly 60% approval rating. Fortunately, it was eventually struck down by the courts. Next slide, please. But what Proposition 187 probably did most of all is it mobilized, it inspired generations of Latinos to fight back through education and not tolerate this bigoted xenophobia that was promoting these types of propositions and legislation that was strictly targeting a community that has always been proven to be hardworking and being identified and scapegoated for all the ills and wills of society. One of those prominent individuals who was influenced by Prop 187, as he has spoken about it himself, is US Senator Alex Padilla. Like so many individuals, seeing the bigoted, xenophobic talking points and hearing them and feeling them drove him into public service. What was beautiful about this is that it did the same thing for so many millions others. And it's what drove people to become police officers, lawyers, politicians, doctors, school teachers. For me, this was all part of my motivation to become a lawyer and to represent and speak for the voiceless. Unfortunately, the anti-immigrant sentiment didn't end there. And on the heels of a war on drugs and a war on crime, President Clinton signed the 96 Immigration Act. Next slide, please. IRERA, as some people call it, was intended to push back on crime and illegal crossings. What it actually did was it ended up punishing families. It made it harder for people to do things the right way, to do things the legal way. So for example, individuals who wanted to petition for their spouse, seek a green card for their wife, a US citizen had to prove that they made enough annually to support their family. The larger your family, the more you had to earn. In effect, this ended up punishing larger and poorer families. Another thing that the 96 Act did was it created 287G. It is a provision within the Immigration and Nationality Act that allows federal law enforcement to deputize state and local law enforcement to execute the immigration laws. The other thing that it did, which was pretty significant, was it established a 1-year filing deadline for asylum seekers. Many individuals don't know the laws in the United States, whether you're a citizen or not. Immigration law is incredibly difficult. So for someone who's coming into the United States, who suffered severe trauma, and then to try to be aware that they have 365 days to file an asylum claim is increasingly burdensome. And we will show over time that a significant portion of individuals will not file their asylum claims, even though they have a right to do so, and because they have the ability to prove and demonstrate that they've suffered persecution, they will miss out on that opportunity. Next slide, please. Bill Clinton was quoted as saying, "This bill strengthens the rule of law by cracking down on illegal immigration at the border, in the workplace, and in the criminal justice system without punishing those living in the United States legally." What President Clinton and Congress failed to understand is that it did just the opposite. It absolutely punished those people who were living here legally. We're talking about mixed status families. And when you punish someone who's undocumented and you are directly impacting someone who's a child of that individual or a spouse of that individual, it is quite contrary to what President Clinton was alleging to promote. Next slide, please. Now, for years, this would be the last we would hear about immigration reform. And the year after the 96 Act was passed, 114,000 people were removed from the United States. A few years later, as many of us, including myself, watched from the House gallery, witnessing President Vicente Fox of Mexico address a joint session of Congress, we were hopeful. There was this promise of cooperation between President George W. Bush and Vicente Fox. And what I recall from that day, at the end of President Fox's speech, was the entire gallery chanting, "Sí se puede, que viva México, que vivan los Estados Unidos, sí se puede." Unfortunately, that was September 6th, 2001, just 5 days before one of the worst days in American history. Next slide, please. As we all know, following September 11th, there was an assessment done of our capacities and our vulnerabilities as a country, which led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Included in that was ICE. What we had seen right in front of our own very eyes is a transformation of looking at things strictly from an immigration and humanitarian lens to now a national security and law enforcement lens. Next slide, please. It wouldn't be until 2006, 5 years after 9/11, and 3 years after the creation of ICE, that we would see champions in a bipartisan effort seek to try to address this problem. In 2006, led by the likes of John McCain, Senator Kennedy, and Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, the Senate was able to pass S 2611, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act of 2006. It was a time to celebrate. People were overjoyed by this great accomplishment. And it was so desperately needed, and all Americans agreed, such that we were able to get 23 Republicans to support this. Next slide. Unfortunately, following that passage of the bill in 2006, the Republican-controlled House decided not to take up the bill, and the bill died at the end of the Congress. Yet again, we would find ourselves in 2013, 7 years later, we would find a group of champions, otherwise known as the Gang of Eight, promoting a new effort to pass immigration reform. And after many, many months of debate, an open and transparent process, not only in the committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, but also on the Senate floor, this bill also passed with the support of 14 Republicans and the leadership of John McCain, Chuck Schumer, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, and of course, Senator Dick Durbin. I will say to you that this process, which I was privy to by virtue of being the chairman of the Judiciary Committee's counsel on the issue, was an incredible process to be a part of. The true bipartisan nature in which these senior statesmen were trying to get this done was miraculous and admirable. Unfortunately, we found ourselves in the same boat that we found ourselves in 2006. A Republican-controlled House that decided not to take the bill up, so it died at the end of the Congress, and President Obama was never allowed to sign the bill. Next slide, please. So what happened as a result? As a result of congressional failure to act and get this done and finally address this the right way, we've had a hodgepodge of initiatives. As much as we criticize Donald Trump for his executive actions, there's been an equal amount of criticism against President Obama for his. His stemmed from frustration that Congress did not act. And so he had to change ICE's priorities. He had to create DACA. He attempted to create DAPA, which was a DACA-like program, but for parents. He instituted a program for children to be able to seek asylum from their home countries through what was known as the Central American Minors Program, or CAM, something that you might all be hearing about in the press right now, as Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is currently talking about reinstituting that program, so children don't have to make the perilous trip. Next slide. What we saw immediately from what the Trump administration, from what the Obama administration did to what the Trump administration did, was instead of focusing narrowly on the worst individuals in society who are actual public safety threats, the Trump administration said everyone's fair game. And the acting director at the time basically told the American public, if you're here undocumented, you should be afraid and you should be looking over your shoulder. Next slide. Because of our failures and because of our attempts to deal with things in a piecemeal administrative fashion, We have seen that worksite raids come and go depending on who's in the White House. We have seen an expansion of 287G programs that allow local law enforcement who's not trained, prepared to do this, trying to execute and enforce local immigration law. In fact, I'll give you one anecdote. The sheriff that you see there with a hat on the bottom right, bottom left-hand corner, he's a former sheriff of Lake County, Illinois. His name is Mark Kern. He decided to have a press conference to talk about the great successes of having a 287G program. He wanted to identify for the community how many foreign-born individuals had been taken into custody and then were subsequently transferred to ICE for the purposes of vetting to see if they were removable. He stated, and I quote, "On August 6, 2008, the Lake County Jail housed 637 inmates. 137 of them are foreign-born. The countries of origin of those inmates are as follows: 105 from Mexico, 5 from Poland, 4 from Puerto Rico." At that point, I turned off the press conference. I was utterly disgusted by the fact that we had a law enforcement officer who was actually trying to actively deport US citizens. This is representative of the fact that we have individuals who don't know what a US citizen looks like when it's plainly in their face, and they still try to deport them. And then of course you have Joe Arpaio. Joe Arpaio, who's infamous nationwide after the Department of Justice concluded that in fact, the Maricopa County Sheriff had engaged in a pattern and practice of constitutional violations profiling Latinos. And he was very proud of it. The other thing that we've seen as a result of our failure to deal with this problem comprehensively, we've seen a growth in family detention. And these images of mothers and children walking through a facility in Dilley, Texas, is representative of the fact that, yes, we are able to detain and house families. But I will tell you, after being the lead federal officer in conducting a year-long review of family detention while I was at ICE, the overarching conclusion is that under no circumstance should children be detained. The trauma, whether they're by themselves or with their parents, is extensive. Now, of course, it's going to be exponentially greater when they're separated, but it's still extensive. Next slide, please. The other thing that we've seen is immigration becomes a back and forth like in a tennis match. Whoever controls the ball gets to dictate where the next shot's going to go. And that's what we saw with the Trump administration when they decided to have zero tolerance, prosecute everyone criminally, separate families in the process, and then we weren't able to bring families and unite them because they weren't prepared for it. They didn't put the systems in place for it. They acted hastily, and fortunately, there was enough outcry by the American public that they had to stop doing this. Next slide. But here's the real issue. If you look at every single year from the time that Arlen Specter, John McCain, and Ted Kennedy in 2006 attempted to pass immigration reform through last year, you will see that we've removed over 5 million people in this country. These are 5 million people that, according to ICE, have final orders of removal, have been picked up, have been put on these planes that you see here, and then are flown home. Now, if you include every presidential administration since Ronald Reagan, the last time we had true immigration reform, then that number is closer to 6.5 million people who have been deported. That's 6.5 million homes, families that have been torn apart. Now, we talk about family separation when we talk about in the context of children at the border being separated, being housed in a different facility while their parents are being pranced out in yellow, orange jumpsuits to be prosecuted criminally. for the simple offense of coming across the border, presenting themselves, trying to seek asylum. But we have to understand that all the people who have gone through judicial proceedings and have had a final order removal, that trauma of separating a mother or a father from their US citizen-born child is equally traumatic. Next slide, please. So where are we today? Well, we have two amazing individuals leading the charge right now. Joe Biden, I think just by virtue of ensuring that FEMA is now involved on the border, dealing with the border crisis that we're seeing with unaccompanied minors coming in record numbers, tells you that he's leading with empathy. He's leading with humanity. And he has a secretary in place who he himself is a refugee from Cuba, who understands this issue all too well. These are individuals who are going to lead and we can be proud of. So my expectation with this administration over the next 4 years is, first and foremost, as they're trying desperately to do, they're trying to unravel the chaos that was created by the last administration. I will tell you that it wasn't just a matter of promulgating new regulations and instituting new executive orders. It was a full-fledged attempt to dismantle the entire system. Dismantle the system in the way that we take in asylum seekers, dismantle the refugee system, dismantle the funding streams that go to USCIS that provides the various benefits to asylum seekers, green card holders, corporate businesses that are trying to bring in their American workers into the United States, and so on and so on and so on. And so I expect that with them leading with a humanity first approach, we're going to see more of what we've already seen. We've seen that ICE is reinstituting priorities. We see that family reunification is a priority, and a task force is being created to ensure that the children who have not been united with their families eventually can be. We're seeing, as I stated previously, that unaccompanied minors are going to be dealt with not just by Border Patrol, but by FEMA. Truly understanding that FEMA, who is very well versed in natural disasters and causes that shake our country at a core, who they are well situated and probably better situated than Border Patrol, no question, to deal with this. Again, the president is leading with a lens of humanity instead of a lens of law enforcement. And then finally, what I will say is refugees and asylum seekers can take a deep breath. We're going to see the numbers go back up to what we were trying to do under the Obama administration. And we expect the refugee numbers on a yearly basis to go back up to about 125,000 from the 15,000 that the Trump administration left us at. And asylum seekers are going to be able to ensure that they will be afforded due process, that they're not going to be sent back in an expedited fashion without being able to see an administrative officer and an immigration judge. So a lot of people have asked me, why are you so optimistic? Well, next slide. Because the time is right. We've never seen this combination before. Good things happen when the Lakers win and when the Dodgers win. But on a political matter, in a political matter or sense, what we haven't seen is a Democratic-controlled Congress with a Democratic-controlled White House. Every time in 06 and in 13 that we tried to pass reform, we had a Republican-controlled House. One time we had a democratically controlled Senate. The other time we had a Republican-controlled Senate. That combination didn't work. This is our shot. This is the community shot. This is the country shot. And my expectation is that it isn't going to be just a Band-Aid approach. It's going to be a concrete, comprehensive approach that will deal with future flows, and not just deal with future flows, but also deal with the motivations for people leaving the sending countries. In short, I expect that it'll be a very holistic, bilateral approach. We have to remember, these people are coming here for a reason, and we can attempt to enforce our way out of it. And what the last 27 years have shown is that that doesn't work. We have to try something new. And it's going to take courage from Congress, no question. But the time is right, and the time is now. Thank you.